Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a delight not only to have you here, but to have this panel here. And as you mentioned, the elephant in the room for the full day has been the euro crisis. The previous panel, some of you attended, already alluded to this. But what we wanted with this panel is to step back a little bit and ask ourselves, where do we stand with the euro crisis? I'm tempted not to say today, because today is a very special day in this respect, and this almost goes too far into the details. But over the past months, the past 2 years, is the euro still able to survive this crisis, and is the European project still able to survive this crisis? And we have 4 panelists here who I think will give quite different answers to that question. I don't want the panelists, you, and I'll introduce you in a second, to talk about the leveraging of the EFSF or core Tier 1 capital ratios, not even about Italian bond yields today, but rather to focus on the more fundamental question, why hasn't this project succeeded thus far, and what can be done, and what should be done in order to bring it to success? If we think it through, all of us have our theories about this. Some say it's because the euro area is too heterogeneous. Others say because there is no democratic legitimacy. Others say because there's no political leadership. A third group says it's because the ECB is too independent, or because the ECB is not sufficiently independent. And what I would like to get from this panel is not only your views about what you think is the root cause, but also how can we then fix it? Because a Dahrendorf symposium without this type of questions could not be a Dahrendorf symposium. As most of you probably know, Lord Ralph Dahrendorf was extremely skeptical about the euro, if not opposed to the project. And so the question we have to ask today is, was he right? Was he wrong? Or did he look at the wrong project? The panelists which we have here today couldn't be better. I start on my right with Sylvie Goulard, who's not only a close friend, she is a member of the European Parliament in her 5th year, right?
No, 3rd.
3rd year. See, it feels much longer, which is good for you. She is president of the European movement in France. She has been extremely active in the European financial crisis as a rapporteur, not only on the European Systemic Risk Board, but then also on various elements of the legislative proposals that have now been discussed. She's just been, she's been elected, as you can see from the program, been designated MEP in the Econ Committee of the year. There is no stronger pro-European than Sylvie. She's fluent in German and French and a truly cross-border person. I continue on my left because it's a delight and honor to have you here in particular today. I think this other elephant in the room was, would you be here or not today? And we are very happy to have you here. This morning I thought I would be happy if he was here. I think I would also be happy if he couldn't make it. But there is still a... But there is still a possibility that my happiness on the second point could come in the next few days. Mario Monti, you don't need a long introduction. He's president of Bocconi University, and I jump on the occasion to say that Hertie School is about to establish a dual degree program with you, so we're delighted to have you here for that reason as well. You are a former European commissioner and an outstanding European and a close friend of Germany, and I know you will say a few words on this. On my right, John Stevens, who is, I hope you'll understand this, we've spoken about elephants in the room. It's more the dinosaur idea that comes to my mind, because John is a conservative politician from the UK who is in favor of the euro. And he used to be a member of the European Parliament for a very long time, was extremely actively involved in the creation of the single currency, closely working with the European Monetary Institute in its early days, and has been fighting for the euro to be adopted in Britain. You are now an independent, and it's a pleasure to have you here. Last but not least, Professor Fred Scharpf, from Germany, an eminent scholar, initially trained in law, then becoming a political scientist, co-founded the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies in Cologne, has written extensively on not only European questions. In fact, his primary work is on the one hand legitimacy, legitimation, but also multi-level governance processes, fiscal federalism, and his book, Governing Europe, Effective and Democratic, is a must-read for all scholars of European integration. Fritz is skeptical about the future of the euro, and he will say a few words on this. So this is the introduction. Sylvie, you get the first shot. Well. Okay, ask my question. If you have to identify the single thing that has not worked and that should be changed, what would it be?
Well, thank you, Henrik. Well, I'm very happy to be here because it's always a pleasure to be in Berlin, even if I must say that it is very frustrating for me to speak English in Berlin, but I will try. If I may, I would like just to say one word. I don't think that we should just say why we consider that we have to save the euro. For me, the euro is much more than the euro, and I do not believe that you can motivate human beings only with negative messages. You cannot motivate the population just by saying, well, we have to save the euro, because if not, it's the chaos. If I remember well, the Unwort des Jahres, the worst word of the year last year in Germany was alternativlos. So there is no alternative. And I consider it very important to take the time, even in such a crisis, to think a little bit why we are here and what we want to do together. And what I want in Europe is still working with the Germans, the Greeks, the Italians, and all the friends from all the countries, being in the Eurozone or outside the Eurozone. But at least in the Eurozone, we have made a common choice, which is to share something. And this is what is at stake, is our vision of life. I do not believe that my life and the life of my children will be better if we remain in the French small box. I really believe that I have a lot to learn from the others, and I don't see it as an attempt to my sovereignty. I think it's a chance in my life that I belong to a continent that has tried to overcome some divisions. To answer your questions more precisely, the only priority, in my opinion, is to create a democracy at the right level. Because I'm quite sure that many citizens are ready to make sacrifices or to change their behavior or to adapt if they have the feeling that they can influence the way the decisions are made, or at least express a preference. They are conservative, they think green, they are liberals, they are socialists, and this is the most important thing. And I take a very concrete example. If we put a flag on the messages coming from Brussels or the capitals to another country, if someone like Lucas in Greece has to say, well, this is a Franco-German diktat, or it has been decided in the European Council, and we have to obey because it is coming from Sarkozy, Merkel, it will be a disaster. If we have a place where we discuss together, and that after a public debate we consider that we have to do something that is either to save money or to fight against tax evasion, or whatever decision is, if then someone is coming back in his country and can say, well, we have decided together, I was there, but they were representatives of the other countries, and they have decided in public, and we know why they have decided, or at least we can try to understand if we are interested in, then we will have changed the face of the euro. And my feeling is that the rest of the world does not believe that the euro is, I don't like the word survive, but that is something that is a long-lasting project if Europe, that is based on democratic values, is taking decisions without respecting democracy. When you have said it, you've not given the blueprint. I do not have the blueprint, and I don't know that anyone can have a blueprint. Whatever we decide, we have to decide it together. And if I may, we are 330 million people in the Eurozone. we should stop looking at democracy like making a referendum in Greece or making a referendum in France or having a vote in the Bundestag in the middle of the European Council. We have to take this group of people, be it one people or not, as a group of people having common interest and capable of discussing together through all the diversity. And you can hear, even in a bad English, you can try to convince Germans, I hope.
Let me turn to Fritz Scharpf. You take a different perspective on that, because do you believe we can establish this European legitimation at the highest level?
Well, as you said, I'm skeptical on that, but I'm much more worried about a frame of public discussion about the euro crisis that gets the origins of the crisis wrong and therefore is looking to wrong solutions. I have 3 points that I would be willing to defend if I were given the time, but I can briefly mention them. The first is fiscal irresponsibility was not the main cause of the present sovereign debt crisis. Second, fiscal retrenchment is not a generally effective solution to the sovereign debt crisis. And third point is the present division in public opinion between surplus and deficit countries is not a division between virtuous countries and sinner countries. On the last point, Germany is now running a large current account deficit, and it is operating with an effective real exchange rate which is about 20% undervalued. That is, the German present economic strength is a consequence of an effectively undervalued exchange rate, and it would disappear if the exchange rates were adjusted to the effective balances between countries. And by the same token, Ireland and Portugal and Spain and Greece and Italy are suffering from an effectively overvalued exchange rate, and their position would strengthen immediately if the exchange rates were adjusted. So my conclusion for this brief introductory statement, without going further into my further arguments, the cause of the present problems that we face is the structure of the euro itself. The present problems are a consequence of a one-size-fits-all monetary policy that impacts on economies that operate on very different dynamics and that have very different structures. And the one-size-fits-all monetary policy is exaggerating the dynamic differences between countries. It's driving countries apart, economies apart, driving some into surpluses and driving others into deficits. And unless that source of the problem is recognized in debates about the reforms and the present solutions, going further in the direction that we're presently going raises the enormous danger that we're driving European countries apart, that we're driving populations against each other, and that trying to save the euro at the costs that we presently consider as alternativlos will destroy democracy in Europe. It will not create democracy at the European level, and it will destroy democracy at the national level.
So we've heard two very different viewpoints. One is very political, and one is extremely economic and leading into two very different directions. Let me turn to you, John. If you've just heard the comment by Fritz, there is no reason for a country like the UK to join. If you've heard the comments from Sylvie, there's probably no reason on a political level to take part, if I look at the UK today, in that endeavor? Why do you still believe it's right for the UK to join?
Well, I think we've got to remember why the euro is set up. I mean, it's set up to complete the single market, and it is about making the European economy capable of operating on a scale that will allow us to compete effectively in a global economy that is utterly transformed, above all by the rise of Asia, and that you cannot ultimately have true, deep free trade and market integration if you retain the right to devalue competitively against each other. And the euro was seen by its advocates always as in part a political project, of course, encouraging a political agenda, but also as a force for ensuring that there was pressure to improve the competitiveness of the whole of the European economy. And I have to say, in that respect, although clearly we are operating against a backdrop of a very dramatic crisis, a far bigger economic crisis than anyone probably anticipated, nevertheless, the euro is actually having this positive effect. I mean, I do actually regard that what has been going on in forcing political change in Ireland, in Greece, in Italy, let us see, and elsewhere, the realization of what is needed to be done to make the European economy more competitive is now a common currency at a popular level. It's not just an elitist debate anymore. And that is very positive. That is a positive step forward. And also, if we are able to go to the logical conclusion of the reforms that are clearly necessary to make the euro long-lasting, which have always been known to be necessary, ultimately a single bond market, a central bank that is a true central bank. If we get there, then the prize is immense. We will have created a really serious single market capable of looking in the face all the challenges that we face at a global level. But I also think that the way this debate has been presented politically is slightly false too, because we're not just fighting here, it seems to me, for our economic well-being and our capacity to remain prosperous and in international terms. We are also fighting for something which I also believe is understood now at a popular level as never before, which is the future credibility of democracy. I mean, this imbalance that has arisen over the last 20, 30 years between the power of markets, which are international, and the power of politics, which has remained national. I mean, that is at the heart of the crisis of democracy that we see actually right across the West, because people are aware of the fact that what their national politicians can actually achieve, the things that really matter to them, whether they have a job, whether they have a pension that's worth anything, all this, the national politicians cannot really deliver this, that it's only through international politics, able to operate at the same level as international markets, that we can create that proper balance that is the essence of a free society. As I think Ralph Dahrendorf talked about a lot, this balance between the power of voting and the power of shopping, essentially, the power of trading. And that's what we're fighting for here. Now, there's nothing inevitable about succeeding, absolutely not. It's very easy to see all the problems. But what I would say is that if we do not succeed here, then any notions of Europe being able to have serious prosperity in global terms over the next 50 years is an illusion. And if it is true that you can only have democracy in a traditional nation state, and that any form of international democratic institutions are impossible, well then that, in my view, is the death warrant of democracy itself.
Mario, the project of the euro was looked at in Italy with immense hope in the beginning. Say, this is a possibility to get away from the high interest rates we have in the market, to be fully part of the single market, the way you described, to gain outside competitiveness. Martin Wolf, I think it was a few months ago, wrote in an op-ed about the senior Italian official whom he didn't identify, saying, now we're in the euro, we don't have the low German interest rates any longer, but we have all that pressure on us. I don't say this because I want you to talk about Italy, but the question about the legitimation and the underlying support for this common project has to be rebuilt in every single country every day. Can this succeed? in the next 3 years?
Well, first of all, the simplest part of all this is to say how delighted I am to be at Hertie. Indeed, we have our almost completed specific project of cooperation, which we cherish very much already. As to your initial remark on whether you would be happier for me today to be here or elsewhere, I must say that perhaps echoing you, a person on the flight from Milan this morning asked me, Mr. Monti, are you sure you are taking the right plane? Then of course I checked and I was sure. Then of course there is the elephant in the room, but I will keep this for the second round if there is one. Because you are contributing to the diffusion of further categories of monetary zoology. Just to answer your question, a warning is be careful when we listen to me, because I've always been considered to be the most German among Italian economists, which always I received as a compliment, but which was rarely meant to be a compliment. So if I say things that appear to you too much German, you may be right. And I don't agree, Henrik, with your initial proposition taken as a given, and indeed as a question for our panel. Why hasn't this project succeeded so far? To me, this project has succeeded. The project of the euro has succeeded. First of all, at the most superficial level, but second also at the deepest possible level. At the most superficial level because as a monetary construction, it has worked out marvelously. Certainly in the good hands of the initial architects. I know how close you were, as many of us were, to Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa, among others, but also, of course, for the skillful management by the ECB. But if I were German, and of course the euro now, as we know, but as we rarely say, is not at all in crisis as a currency, which is perhaps surprising, but is true. But I think that the success of the euro as a project is to be measured also at the more fundamental level, and I would do so particularly if I were German. Germany has been finally persuaded to accept the notion and the realization of the euro instead of the beloved Deutsche Mark, because it was coming with a number of constraints and behavioral guidance set out largely by Germany in order to do what? To diffuse throughout Europe the Stabilitätskultur that we breathe, even non-Germans, in this country. Has this been achieved or not? To a large extent, I believe this is being achieved. Certainly through rounds. There has been the first round where the incentive was enormous for countries like mine to make it in the first round of the euro, and incredible transformations took place. But let me take even the most unfavorable test case of all, Greece today. Who could say that the project of the euro has not been working? Greece is doing much too little relative to what is set out by the Troika, etc. But is doing enormously more than it would have ever done under any other circumstance in terms of transforming its society, its institutions, its habits, etc. A well-known German professor, one of the authors of one of those appeals to the Federal Constitutional Court, and now even to the Court of Justice of the European Communities in Luxembourg, said at a recent conference, normally this change that we are seeing in Greece takes a generation. Now, if I were German, I would be proud that my culture of stability is proving to be even a better export product than so many of our manufacturing products. It is working. Of course, it's not working perfectly. And to me, the two deficiencies are perhaps the most concerning, the one that Professor Scharf identified, and which was somewhat prophetically set out in 1997 by Martin Feldstein in his article, The Euro and International Conflict. The Euro was meant to bring together the peoples of Europe. It is dividing them. And a number of acrimonies, stereotypes coming back, north, south, etc., is really dividing Europeans. Plus, of course, the public finance problem. But there, too, we must be aware that in the aggregate, the public finance problem, be it deficit or debt relative to GDP of the Eurozone, is less than the US, is less than the UK, is less than Japan. Of course, it creates much more of a problem. Why? I think for two reasons. One is your initial item, Henrik, of heterogeneity. And the other one, because we are rightly so transparent and so self-flagellating as a system, because we are not one state, but we are a system in the process of integration, that we have set up a system of flashing lights and indicators and constraints that reveals every divergence, and this is very good, and so helps create in the marketplace the very crisis that then we fight to deflect and reduce. For this first round, I will stop here. I will not deny that we have enormous work to do ahead of us. I will, if there is a chance later on, say also a word on Italy. But I will also like to say that a lot, really a lot in my view, as to the development of this project depends on Germany. And I would like, for the reasons that perhaps I will explain later on, to see a Germany which would be even better than today's Germany, in the sense of being more rigorous. I said more rigorous. More consistent over time, less short-termist, and more patient.
We will meditate this message. Fritz, I mean, we've now have 4 different views, and I think the way Europeanists always looked at the euro was to say that once it is in place, everything that had to follow will follow. This functionalist idea, which was always there. And we can just remind that the euro was born out of 2 different ideas. One is France, on the one hand, saying, we start with a single currency, we have a strong economic government that integrates, to take up Fritz's point, that integrates the economic space, and then everything is going to work. And on the other side, the Germans saying, we first integrate through the single market, and at the end point, we will have the single currency. What did the European leaders do? They found a compromise. And the compromise was, we start with the single currency immediately, but we don't do anything to get the space, the economic space, closer and to avoid or to escape the heterogeneity problems that you describe. So, Fritz, do you really think, just creating a response to Mario, do you really think that this positive reading of the success of the euro will ultimately result into the functional spillover effects that a functional analyst would hope to see or expect to see?
What happened is that these expectations were half right. They were right for the market in traded goods and services. There, creating the single currency equalized prices throughout Europe because competition was enormously increased and so prices converged. But the same expectation did not work for the sheltered sector. Because there the international competition played no role, and that's the crucial element of the euro. The euro brought down interest rates that had diverged enormously before, all to the low German levels, which meant for all other countries that had not been in the D-mark zone that money suddenly became extremely cheap, and that credit could be had at practically zero or even negative real interest rates. That generated, in those countries that benefited from low interest rates, an enormous growth of domestic demand and domestic employment, not in the exposed sector, not in the internationally traded sector, but in construction above all, and in domestic services. And the consequence was that prices overall did not rise. The ECB was very successful in containing consumer price inflation. It was not successful at all because it didn't care about it in the real estate bubbles in Ireland and Spain, because asset prices are of no concern for the ECB or other central banks. So we had enormous inflation in asset prices, but no inflation in consumer prices. And as a consequence, the convergence that had been expected turned out to become an increasing divergence because of these effects. And as a consequence, the international competitiveness that John was talking about in those countries that were weak to begin with was not increased. It was destroyed by the euro because wages increased domestically in both the sheltered and the exposed sectors, and thereby domestic production for export decreased and decreased and decreased, and we have enormous current account deficits in countries like Ireland, Spain, Greece, Italy, and so on. And we have enormous current account surpluses in countries like Germany and Austria and the Netherlands and so on. And convergence didn't change that.
Sylvie, the normal response by policymakers in such a situation would be to say either we need the common budget, we need a European finance minister, Jean-Claude Trichet calls for that, we need labor mobility, we need transfer mechanisms. This is all known from the optimum currency area literature. If you look at the political decisions that have been taken in the past 1.5 years, this economic governance package, although I don't want to go into the details, but do you think it is possible to create this legitimacy at the European level that would respond to the heterogeneity that we've just seen described by Fritjof?
Well, I don't know, but if I would think it's absolutely impossible, I would try to make another job. Of course, it's very difficult. First of all, I want to say that I really doubt that any of the people, any of the European leader right now has an idea of optimum currency literature or whatever. I mean, one of the problems is that the crisis is, on one hand, very political, on the other hand, very technical, and we try to find solutions more with lawyers' approach than economists. So I'm not sure that they are aware of what you've said, but let's leave this. In the Parliament, we are a certain amount of MEPs who are really fighting for this. Let's take the budget, for example. How can the German Chancellor with the French President and some others say on one hand they will do whatever it requires to save the euro, and on the other hand in the budgetary discussions stick to a position that is simply considering that the EU does not need a budget. We have 1% more or less. The total amount of the European budget is around 100 billion a year, which has nothing. I mean, if you compare this with the decisions taken on the fund, it's amazing. I mean, in the last decades, we have been spending days in the European Council to discuss if we put the budget at 1.13 or 1.15. without having in mind what we really need. I would not say we need a budget with 25 or 30%, but a real budget and a growth-oriented budget, taking into account the possibility to spend money at the European level in a better form than a national, let's say on research or on renewable energy or on this is not part of the discussion on the crisis. And of course, I really believe that once again, this is a political choice, how much money you spend at the national level or at the European level. But the answer that because you have to be very reasonable at the national level, you cannot have a European budget is absurd from an economic point of view. You really need to, or you can transfer some money at the European level and reduce the national spending. And you can, for €1 spent at the European level, even make some savings. Let's take defense policy. Do you really think we have, in all the member states, having still a defense, a good use of the money we put into defense? Do you really think we could not save money in putting the defense policies together? Because then we would buy at a larger scale. This is just an example, but of course, budget is a real question. Of course, we have to check how the money is spent. We have to be sure that the programs are the right ones. We have good and bad experiences. I do not want to say that at the European level everything is fine. But this very apparently simple idea, because we do not have money, we do not have to put money at the European level, is not very convincing.
Europe has always been described as functioning on output legitimation. So the results are providing the legitimacy to the process behind. And it's not the direct input. Now, what you describe is an entirely different way of looking at this European Union, with having taxation, having the representation that comes with it, and the politicization in the European Commission that would be required. I look at you, since you worked in the European Commission. Do you think this is possible to have this politicization approach at the European level?
I think part of it is possible and necessary. Part of it is possible, but I believe profoundly damaging. Politicization in terms of strengthening, as Sylvie Goulard is underlining today and throughout all her work, the democratic legitimacy, yes, and of course the European Parliament, which is an increasingly powerful but not yet quite recognized entity by public opinions, has to be the key of that. As to the view that many have, that in order for Europe as a whole to be more democratic, and in order to trigger more the interest of European citizens in EU-level political life, we need to make EU-level political life more similar to the national life of our democracies. I'm profoundly skeptical. I'll tell you why. For two reasons. I do not believe that the crisis of the EU political life lies mainly at the EU level. I think what is in crisis is, for a number of reasons, there is no better alternative, but is democracy at the national level and political life at the national level. And to me, the idea that we must, I say we, because I still have the mentality of European institutions and authorities, which of course, I must say I never had this feature, but normally are full of complexes, as they were doing the dirty job for European citizens. I've always been aware that we did things that probably were right, others that probably were wrong, but on the whole, I never had this complex of feeling guilty because we operated EU-level powers, but many do. And so love to have occasions like negative referenda to indulge in self-flagellation. Especially, you can imagine how much I love northern populations, being deeply Mediterranean, although from Milan, but this is especially a connotation of Nordics in Europe, to feel so guilty because they administer a public power. But I lost a bit of my point.
It was a very useful remark. Thank you.
Okay. But no, but I'm not finished. But the idea that for example, the Commission should become a political animal based on the horizontal axis on right and left. Whereas at the national level, the meaning of the right and the meaning of the left is increasingly questionable, is doubtful to me. To me, the Commission has to be political, but that is the party of integration. And as long as the Commission does have also enforcement functions, be it enforcing the Stability Pact or competition or the internal market, if it were to be perceived as a highly party political thing, its credibility and its acceptance by the recipient countries who receive the warnings, the sanctions, etc. Now, I cannot imagine what would happen in Italy today if the warnings, the admonitions, the blue letters, as you would say in Germany, coming to Italy came, for example, by a center-left European Commission. I think they would lose much of their credibility. So, to me, there are huge problems of democratic lives at the national level, certainly more democratic legitimacy through the European Parliament, but I would not be obsessed about making every aspect of European institutions to look more similar to the ones existing at the national level.
I will come back and ask you on Italy, but Sylvie, you wanted to react very briefly, and then I'll go to John.
No, I don't know how you see in English the difference between politisch and parteipolitisch. And this is the key. I mean, I very rarely disagree with Mario Monti, but I have to say that on this last point, of course, I'm not for a politicization in the sense that left-handed commission gives the right hand. That's not the point. But the letter of Draghi and Trichet was criticized very much in the parliament as being representative of certain political options. You can agree or disagree, but I can tell you that the left does disagree with the content of the letter. The annual growth survey produced by the Commission at the beginning of the year was criticized very much by the left for being completely ideologically oriented. And of course, when you read it and that you look that there are more proposals on the side on cutting wages than even mentioning the fight against tax evasion or the possibility to make some tax reform, then you look at... So when you were there, it was at this level. But please don't consider that this commission is not playing a political game, and some commissioners are much more politicized than you seem to say. At least you can listen to the debates in the parliament. It's obviously clear that some people consider right now the commission being, is it true or not, but on one side. Mm.
John, when you argued in your first statement, you spoke a lot about the external effects and the benefits of the euro. Everything we've said now is this internal functioning. And in particular, if I look at the political landscape and the position of the country you're coming from, do you think there is a place? I see your point that it might be useful to have the euro from an outside or entirety perspective. But the internal functioning, both when it comes to divergences, but also when it comes to legitimacy, don't look very solid in the UK, right?
Well, I mean, the underlying reality is that you cannot have a proper single market if you retain the right to devalue competitively. And that's why I slightly disagree with the historical account that we heard earlier, which is because I do think that one crucial element in the creation of the euro was indeed the failure of the exchange rate mechanism, which proved that you could not have, there was no halfway house between having full-blown monetary union and in today's global markets, and even then, having free-floating exchange rates which would ultimately destroy the single market. And the single market is the heart and soul of this. And of course, you're right in what has in everything that went wrong with the low interest rates and the fact that the competitive pressures in the non-traded sector were not there. And that's what is now happening. We are now moving on from the traded sector to the non-traded sector through cutting fiscal deficits and by putting the pressure on there, so which will be, in my view, very beneficial. I think it's important that we see that we are engaged in a process. The euro, as you said, is working in this respect. It is actually forcing through changes which are absolutely essential if the European economy is to retain this scale of a large single market that is really functioning, and which will allow it to be globally competitive. Now, where does this leave Britain? I mean, obviously, the point being that if you cannot really be part of a single market if you retain the right to devalue, well, that is the truth of the matter over time. At the moment, we have an opt-out on this, along with Denmark. But I cannot conceive, if the euro survives, as I'm sure it will, how that is a position that can long persist. It is a complete free ride, essentially. And I also think that my own country has been, particularly the city, which I vaguely part of, is that they fail to see, it seems to me, the tremendous potential of being a real centre for the euro as a global currency, and still have a perception which is a rather different one of what sort of financial centre, what sort of strategy London should be following. But I mean, this is throughout history, financial centres have mistaken their true interests. I mean, one can look at Venice, one can look at New York, who've thought that it was better to back the South initially in the American Civil War, failed to see the industrialization of the northern states. I mean, financial centres frequently get it wrong where their true interests lie, and I'm not absolutely convinced that London has got it right at the moment.
The debate we've heard thus far still gets us into very different topics and discussions. But I wanted to take up one point Ralph Dahrendorf made in his writings, and perhaps ask you, and this is where you could also talk a little bit about Italy. He said the euro would split the continent. And he was not only referring to the Eastern European or the newly joining member states, but also inside the euro area due to the effects that were described by Fritz Scharpf. If you look at Italy today, and this point I made before, are you still benefiting? Is there still the sense that Italy is benefiting? And what has to be done in order to make Italy this full pillar of the common currency?
I think Italy is still benefiting because the benefits from belonging or not belonging to a single currency arrangement, to me, are not just flows per month or per year, but are a legacy which evolves over time. So if we imagine for a second that Italy had not been part of the euro, we would have by now a history of the last 12 years or so which would be filled up of more inflation, less disciplined policies, a much wider public sector, disorderly conducted, less respect for future generations. We would be even less German, okay? So whatever happens at the margins in 2011 is almost irrelevant relative to this foregone opportunity. Now, I think Italy, like other countries which now have difficulties, as Professor Scharpf underlined, went to sleep because the markets went to sleep, because they, for 8 years or so, at the beginning of the life of the euro, failed to recognize different credit risks. So all those develop. Although, Professor Scharpf, I remember another time we had a very interesting conversation on how far competition policy of the EU should reach, because in your view, which I share, that much of the problem is in the shielded or sheltered sectors of our economies, one could say that if EU competition policy had been even more active and not caring only about the effects on the single market at the European level, but had been more intrusive and had helped member states to clear up these rents and privileges at the national level, perhaps that would help those member states to become more competitive. But letting this aside for the moment, I think a country like Italy then woke up when the markets after 2007 woke up. I think the position for Italy, however, is different, let me stress it, from Greece, Ireland, Portugal, or even Spain. Not so much and not only because of size, because of a stronger real economy, and for a public finance situation which, seen at the margin in terms of annual deficits, is actually better than France's. But the position of Italy, I see it, which increases our responsibility as Italians. We are by no means a peripheral country. In an economic geography sense, at least northern Italy is at the core of Europe, and politically and historically, Italy cannot evade its responsibility of a founding member state. Much of what we impute as imperfect functioning to the Franco-German couple, which has to function as a joint engine, of course in a context of democratic legitimacy, more community methods, etc. But I think the functioning of this couple would be better and more in the common interest if Italy in the last few years had not completely expelled itself from being there, in fact, at the European table. Just one last note, the divisions among Europeans, we discussed the psychological and political aspect, but in the vein of John Stevens' remarks, I would underline very much that I am very concerned about the division between the 17 and the 27, not just for what the other 10 miss in terms of power of co-decision with the 17, but also because of the sorts of Europe that may come out from a Eurozone where the others do not play a role. I fear that we are going towards a Europe of two speeds where, paradoxically, each group believes it is the first speed. Because certainly France and Germany and Italy, I hope, believe that they are in the first speed because they have accepted the courageous game of monetary and tomorrow political integration, but they don't realize that gradually they are becoming a corporatist, rather closed, not so much open and competitive, loving Europe, whereas the UK, Denmark, Sweden, Poland, and other new member states also believe they are the first speed Europe because they tend to be more competitive globally. And I would love to see a Europe that stops specializing, some of us in economic union, the Nordics and the non-Euro, which take competition and the single market seriously, and others within the Eurozone specializing in monetary union, where, with the notable exception of Germany in the last couple of years, international competitiveness suffers because we are a closed shop.